I'm Larry Moss, and I'd like to welcome you to Brush with Knowledge. Throughout this series, we're going to explore the role of teaching artistry as a tool to transform education and ignite your imagination. In each episode, we'll highlight the work of a different teaching artist and offer ideas that you can use in your own classrooms, meetings, and even the larger communities you serve and live in. Today, I'm talking with Unique Fair, a fine artist and college art professor. Welcome, Unique.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm always curious how people find their way into the arts. I'm hoping you can share a bit of your journey that brought you to this point in your career. What got you started?
I would be happy to. The way my mother tells the story, since I was a child, I'd always been drawing my favorite characters on Saturdays, whether it be Pokemon characters or Yu-Gi-Oh characters, you name it. It's always been a part of my lived experience. And at a certain point, I went to high school at World of Inquiry here in Rochester. And what ended up happening was they started asking us how would we like to use what we like to do to benefit the school. Would you like to do posters? Would you like to do political things, stuff like that? And I often found that that was something I gravitated toward. I was very much the art kid in the classroom, and it really just became very common for me to do. What really led me into the arts overall would be my my initial mentorship with a local painter named David Haygood. David Haygood was very encouraging and really encouraged me to push myself as I developed. This culminated initially with a showcase at City Hall in, I want to say, 2014. We were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, and I made a piece, and that piece itself, it wasn't just the process of making the work, it was also the dialogue I had with people who enjoyed the work. People came up to me and said, this piece reminds me of my grandmother, this piece reminds me of this, and I really settled into me how much impact my work can have on the community around me, and I've been very invested on doing things like that since. I'm a comic book kid, and there's this iconic phrase, of course, in Spider-Man, with great power there must also come great responsibility. But if you look at it like beyond a comic book, a lot of philosophers lean toward the idea that we have a human responsibility to take what we are passionate about and wield that for, the betterment of the world around us. Maybe we're not, saving the world or whatever, but, using what we're passionate about to leave the world a little bit of a better place.
I love that you're seeing your art skills as your superpower, because so often, art is the extra thing. It's not the important thing that we value, so I think that's phenomenal that you have not only acquired this superpower, but recognize it and are using it for the greater good. Now, you mentioned this mentor of yours. Was this in school? Did this start in school, or was this an outside?
This was outside of school. David Haygood, he at the time would mentor young children who are interested in the arts outside of school, usually Saturdays, that kind of like every week kind of deal. And beyond that, I would say I've been really fortunate with many of my mentors. I've also had other mentors, David Haygood's one of them, but also Chris Pallas and Kevin Serwacki. I had the opportunity to meet them when, I want to say, at the end of my 8th grade year of middle school, and then they were mentors of mine from there to now. Meeting them outside of school as well at after school programs was really advantageous, and they gave me a very functional understanding of what those industries look like and what I should aspire to relative to the field.
And you're still working with Chris and Kevin now?
Yes, I work with them at Blue Toucan Studios. Love the work. It's always fun. And as a working artist, it's really fantastic to see how their process adapts and what skills I'm able to learn. It's great to see that they are learning as they're instructing me. And it's a very important process. I think we often think of the arts as a fully formed thing that always exists, and it's immaculate in its existence. And seeing the work and process of it, the trial and error of it, both with your teachers and in your own experience, I think really helps humanize the process and make it more accessible.
You've done a great job talking about the whole picture of, working artists and being able to mentor with several people, Chris Pallas, Kevin Serwacki, David Haygood, I'm also interested in what your experience was in school you said you had the opportunity to use your power and use your skills to create things in school. Were there teaching artists that you saw in the classroom and assembly programs that also inspired you to, because we will get back to you as a teaching artist shortly, where you are now in the classroom teaching and using this in schools. So did you have experiences like that really kept you going?
I definitely did. I have to give shout outs to my my art teacher, Teresa Funk. She was definitely one of those teachers who was very encouraging and also really valued seeing how making sure the work could exist in other spaces, not just in her classroom, but in the environment. Beyond that as well, there were also extracurricular opportunities with World of Inquiry as a school. It's an expeditionary learning model. So often they want to find ways to make the knowledge that they want to impart more accessible to children on a personal level. So that would result in me making more art projects about my about my education than maybe one of my classmates who was more interested in storytelling, for example. As well, we would have events, intensives, we would call them, where we would pick a community professional who works in a certain field and learn from them. I would always pick the arts-oriented one, and sometimes that would lead to me going to RIT, but it also very distinctly led to me meeting Sean Dunwoody. And Sean Dunwoody at his studio, I had the chance to meet him and talk again, have those same conversations. And I think that's really what's important for the arts, is that I've had the opportunity for very generous and patient people to pour time and energy into my work. And I think that's very necessary when we encourage young artists in teaching.
You referred to somebody else in your class that was more, while you were doing the art, they were doing more of the storytelling. And I don't see those as
I would agree,
unique and separate things. I mean, when I look at your art, there's a story behind everything.
But I mean more explicit, more explicitly.
Words.
More like they were more telling, like they were like writing short stories while I was more illustrating. My background has a lot of, as mentioned, explores comic books a lot. So I was, doing my little comics here or there. And that's what I mean to say with that difference. I agree with you though, that I think art is primarily a storytelling medium.
And often gets the story across faster.
Yes.
Because somebody looks at a picture and then sort of like they get as far into the details as they wish to, but start with the whole picture in front of them. What else can you say about the stories that influence your work today? I mean, you talked about the comic books getting you into this, but today I've seen you speak and talk about your work and get really into the stories behind them. So what stories are you looking for? And maybe this is even a way to talk about your interest in using your painting and activism.
Yeah, absolutely. I would start with just a shorter story where my mother was very invested in my interest in the arts, and I'm very thankful to that. One thing we would do is we'd find ways to go to art museums when I was a kid all the time. To this day, I could walk through the Memorial Art Gallery with my eyes closed, and I could point to a wall and tell you what's on that wall because just my experience there. But throughout the museums I would go to, one thing I would often see is an absence of folk who looked like me or folks who reflected my own lived experience. I used to say very often that I would walk into a gallery and I could look at 100 paintings and I could count on one hand with fingers to spare how many paintings depicted people like me, and with fewer fingers, how many of them were painted by people like myself. And that was an absence that I've felt desired to correct over the years. A lot of my work often focuses on people that are not often seen, especially in the canon of fine art, where you would look at certain folk who are often just not considered worth depicting, or people who are not focused on, whether it be marginalized groups of color or members of the LGBT community. A lot of my work seeks to document those folk, but also to document them on their own terms. Often marginalized groups are depicted in archetypal ways, stereotypical ways. So a big part of my work is talking to the sitter and asking, how do you want to be seen? What do you want to convey? And finding a grounds there where I'm painting something I'm excited about, but something that is also evocative of their identity.
Something that they're excited about.
Absolutely.
And there's one more thing that I think of when to kind of lay the groundwork, the background for everybody listening is and I only learned this because I sat through one of your talks recently, your interest in using non-toxic art materials and paints. And, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about safety in the workplace and all, and you go so far as to even instruct people on how to use things that are safe. I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. So part of my work, I am interested in the accessibility of the arts. And that's not just having people depicted in the forms, it's also having people have the opportunity to practice them. And with a lot of them, sometimes you run into issues of elitism where something like oil painting often is segregated from other mediums because we talk about it in such a lofty way. So I'm really invested in encouraging people to use those mediums as often and as fluidly as they would like. The other element too is not just increasing accessibility through outdoing the propagandic impact of those things, but also to encourage people to use them in a way that's safe. I think increasing accessibility, encouraging people has to be matched with enabling people in the safest way you can. And with certain mediums and certain materials, there are dangerous elements. Sometimes it's a matter of pigments or the mediums and solvents you use. So a lot of my practice is me researching ways to remove certain colors from palettes or to remove certain solvents or other materials and figure out a way to do that is prioritizing people's health and safety while also making it cost effective. So that I like to think that my goal is to make sure that if I started oil painting when I was 14, that my 14-year-old self with my 14-year-old budget could do what I do, could in theory do what I do now.
And what I've seen is that you're not just giving safe materials to your students to use, but you're explaining to them what the safe materials are and encouraging them to further stick with these things. And in the classrooms that I've seen you in, and it's ranged from, you know, I've seen you with little kids and adults and everything in between. It's really fun to see you working with them and putting materials in their hands and letting them mix things on their own and experiment. And I remember one classroom in particular that stands out clearly in my mind where you offered them tubes of paint and said, go at it. And some of the kids used their brushes and others just wanted to see how many colors they could stir up to create. So I guess what I'm seeing is in your teaching, it is way more than just asking them to use the materials you give them and play with that, but to play and go further and keep mixing and exploring the material.
I would say I think the arts are a very precious thing, but we shouldn't necessarily be precious with them. We should encourage people to try out new things and see what strangeness they can conjure. You know, we should give people permission. And that's something I talk about a lot when I teach, is that my most important thing, I tell all my students, everyone who I ever instruct in front of, the most important thing about art to me is forgiving yourself in advance. You have to accept when you're working that sometimes it's not going to come out how you want to. Sometimes it might come out differently than you were expecting, but you owe it to yourself to have that journey and accept those outcomes, because it is a journey. It's not an event. It's not the season finale. It's an action that is a part of a journey. Your art is a part of our day-to-day life, and giving yourself room to have days where you do something you know how it's going to come out, days where you do things you have no idea, and everything in between. It's a lot about encouraging people to explore again on their own terms and with their own autonomy.
So let's step away a little bit from teaching the art to teaching with the art. Mm-hmm. What do your students learn from you that goes beyond just the paintbrush or the crayon, as that's also a safe material to use? Right. Or what are you hoping that your students are getting out of this?
One thing I hope students get out of it often is discovering more diverse ways of communicating and reaching out to different communities. One of my favorite painters who's still alive, Emory Douglas, he was the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and he was tasked with their newspaper. And a lot of his illustrations, they would touch on very complex political subject matter, talking about international issues, local issues, and drawing parallels between them in an intersectional way. And what he would do, again, this is the 1960s, the communities he's reaching reaching out to often struggle with literacy because of their lack of access to education. And what he would do is illustrate things in ways that communicated so effectively that he could give his illustrations to someone who was functionally illiterate, and they could still get a great idea of what they were experiencing. So you were able to transcend language barriers, education barriers, and really make sure that everyone had a say and everyone had was given information. In my own work, something I'd like to do, and that's where I want to come from the work, where people have an ability to convey and communicate regardless of language barriers or communication barriers. One of the projects I like to do with my students is I talk to them about, if you walk outside and you see a stop sign, we all know what a stop sign looks like regardless of language, because we see the red. We see that they're like the distinct shaping of stop signs is consistent across the world, because there's a certain level of how that shape looks and how we perceive it as human beings that we know a stop sign when we see a stop sign. So a lot of my work teaches students, hey, how would you convey that an area is very warm? But see how you would do that with minimal mark making, simplistic mark making. Maybe you don't use fire, but you still want to convey heat. How would you go about that in a way that is not very literal necessarily? And I think that work is really important. I think communication and also conveying truth is incredibly important in the modern day, especially. I think with recent events and just the world as is, often misinformation can spread faster than truth sometimes, because we have to curate it more carefully. But I think learning new ways to disseminate that information is really pivotal to the well-being of just the well-being of society.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to distill that down a little bit.
Fair enough.
No, that I loved the long explanation. That's fantastic. But a question that I'm trying to ask everybody that I talk to on this podcast: define teaching artist? Mm-hmm. This is a term that I think we're going to keep refining. And when I listen to you discuss everything you do, whether you talk about your art or you talk about being in the classroom, it's all teaching. It's all telling a story. It's all sharing. How would you define a teaching artist?
I would say, if I had to define it at its most bare, it would be an artist whose their personal practice prioritizes the education of others, prioritizes the informing of others. A lot of my work, again, leans toward educating others and increasing levels of accessibility and information. So I'd say that's what leads me into being a teaching artist. I'd say as well that a lot of my mentors and folk, they themselves have been educators in their own right, where they have taught us information through the arts and other factors. So I think that's really what it comes down to: someone whose artistic expression involves the instruction of others and does it in a way that is accessible.
Now, you're fairly young, so you're actually new to this, relatively speaking. Is it what you thought it would be when you got into it?
Yes and no. In some ways, I had a really early stable understanding of the idea that teaching is, again, it's a process of taking time. Often you don't walk up to a student and say one thing one time and they perfectly remember it. It's often a process of repetition and giving people room to stumble. That's something I expected. It's something I've experienced as a student. The areas that potentially were unexpected often is how often you can learn from your students themselves. I was surprised sometimes where I'll be in a classroom and someone will I'll talk about a certain concept and they'll go, oh, it's kind of like this. And I'll stop and I'll go, it is kind of like that. And I'll often be able to add that into my own skill set. I think education, as much as we are giving to our audiences, we're also receiving from them as well. And it's I think there's a lot of beauty in that there's a reciprocation of information.
Where do you see the field of teaching artistry going?
I would say, and I've been both a student and I'm currently a teacher during this period of time, we are at a point where art accessibility is increasing dramatically. We are seeing, for example, whether it be YouTubes or TikToks or other websites where people are able to learn different information and have relationships with teachers, we're seeing, I think, an uplifting of the field where people are beginning to see the value in the arts, but also see that there are a lot of ways to access it. Very often, we've seen in the past that art programs are often cut from public schools and other resources. And while that's always unfortunate, we should continuously organize to advocate for those programs in schools. It's been exciting to see how that's expanded outside of those environments and how the arts are, and not only just the arts generally, but very specific skill sets. It's much easier now to find a teacher, an art teacher on any subject. Let's say it would have been 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. If I wanted to learn about specifically the process of knitting dragons or something like that, I don't know. I could find someone who specializes in that, and I could access that information. I also think we're at a better period of communication where it's easier for me to find an artist I really enjoy and just reach out to them on Instagram and say, hey, do you have any thoughts about this or that? I have people who reach out to me often and will say, I really enjoyed this piece. Could you talk to me a bit about what technique you did here? Like, how did you get this effect? And that's something that I know is more accessible now than it was even, again, just 10 years ago. When I was 10 years ago, I was in late high school. I remember just seeing, like, there were sometimes, like, the libraries will always be useful, but there are definitely things I remember reading in library books I couldn't necessarily find online then that I can find easier now online because there's easier accessibility and documentation.
So in every episode, I am asking my guest to offer something, to teach something to listeners that can be taken into all of your classrooms and meetings and whatever other places you have to do little demonstrations and get people working together or using creative thinking to move forward. So, Unique, what would you like to share?
One of my favorite projects that I've done working with Teaching Artist Rocks is a best way to explain it is that I have a term for it, but it's basically semiotics. It's the theory of imagery. And the idea is that how do you convey information to a viewer? Often there's some things like there are cultural norms where certain numbers are considered unlucky. And then there are human norms where, like, the color red is intense in some way. We all perceive that. So I have the project I do is based off of giving a prompt to students and telling them, how do you want to convey that with an image? How do you want to convey a series of information? Perhaps you would give the students a prompt of, it's rainy outside, bring your umbrella, and see how they would give information that would convey that. Maybe it would be as simple for younger students of drawing an umbrella, but then you can scale that upward for students who are in high schools and middle schools. I've done this with college students as well, where you would give them something that simple, but you would say, you can't draw an umbrella. It's hot outside, you can't draw fire. It's there's a snowstorm, but you can't draw you can't draw snowflakes. You have to figure out a way to convey that information in a way that another student could guess accurately fairly easily. So what the project ultimately turns into is a competition, and a friendly competition. There are no real points, but the idea is have two teams, give each one of them a prompt. And then the idea is both teams make signs, then they give the sign to the other team, and that the other team has to guess to the best of their ability what that sign is trying to convey. And it often teaches a way of communication. And what I've seen in some groups is that for a group of 6 people working together, the idea is so obvious to them, and then they'll give the idea to the other team and they'll realize, oh, we didn't think that, that's how they might consider it. So there's often a back and forth of dialogue there through the imagery alone.
So let's set up a scenario for this.
Sure.
We have a meeting. So let's even make this a corporate setting so that it's real different. And you have a software development team and a hardware team trying to accomplish whatever new task. How might you go about setting that up?
So I would say in that case, that's a really great example because often, especially when we talk about information, there are some areas that require a certain level of expertise to speak on efficiently. And one of the problems we have with information is that, for example, I'm not a physicist. There's a lot of information a physicist might want to tell me, but do I understand what they're really saying? So with illustration, there's room to create information that's more digestible, similar to the work of Emory Douglas. So in that case, for example, if you have an engineer trying to communicate that information, perhaps it, at its most simple, could look like diagrams, but also could be a series of illustrations or symbols that would indicate the nature of materials. Are these materials safe? Do you need gloves? Do you need other things like that? And it could be developed in a way that someone who is a complete layman in that particular area can access that information and know very particular knowledge. And because they're viewing the information, interacting with it, there's a certain level of accessibility that's increased that transcends a barrier, a language barrier. For example, there are some words I see written down that I might not try to spell on my best, or try and say on my best day because they involve in like an umlaut to them, for example. But the idea of illustrating it often would increase communication. So I think there's value there, and not only understanding how another party works, but also to see how other people interact with your information. To us, we always sound like we're making perfect sense, but to a third party, we might be speaking gibberish. So the illustrations I find in that setting would be valuable to show teams what each party brings to the table and why they're all necessary and important.
Fantastic. Let's talk business and how you run your business as an artist, because everybody is different. Every art business is different. You are an art professor, so you're teaching at the college level. You have income there. You also have gallery shows where you sell your art. Talk about your business model, both as an artist and teaching artist, and how all of those things fit together, and how you, and any suggestions and recommendations you have for somebody following, just getting into this field now.
Yeah, I would say one thing to do is, and I guess this would be advice Chris and Kevin have given me over the years, where finding things that are your stable incomes, and then also figuring out ways to have projects that can build up into different revenue streams. For example, teaching, I'm really passionate about it. It does offer me a very consistent income. My oil painting and my portrait work that you see in museums and galleries, that work is valuable and something that's very fulfilling for myself, but the income on that can at times be not as consistent necessarily. But ways I can increase consistency on that, for example, is making a print series of those paintings. I often, again, talking about accessibility, I recognize that not everyone can afford a custom oil painting necessarily. So something I'll do is I'll often make prints of those works, and that increases the accessibility while also increasing my audience. Not everyone necessarily wants an oil painting, but they might want a print on their wall possibly. As well, often just looking around and seeing ways you can interact with the community, seeing like what resources exist in that regard. And I would say, as far as it leans into teaching, trying to find work that I would say you're very passionate about. I think it's very easy for people to say, just pick a job that's a job. And I think especially for artists, it's really important that we pick work that satisfies a certain part of what we do. The arts is not notoriously a field for like making like millions and billions of dollars necessarily, but people do it because they're passionate about it. We do it because we love to do it. So it's important that when we're looking at our revenue streams or like ways of income, that we are trying to find fields or areas that do meet those requirements, or at least if we're unable to do that currently, finding ways to offset that by having passion projects on the side that might meet areas of our desire that do not that are not reflected necessarily in our current business models. For myself, I've been really enjoying doing individual shows and selling work there, and as well doing demos and instructing and things like that, whether it be at the local colleges or local museums. And that's been a very diverse experience. I joke with my friends that like my weekly schedule is very fluctuating. Like they'll ask me, oh, what are you doing at 3 p.m. In 2 weeks? And I'll say, we'll find out because often my teaching schedule is fairly consistent, but whether or not I'm doing a guest lecture here or in Geneva or in other spaces, that is something that's very flexible. And often I'm putting out a lot of feelers to see, hey, would you be interested in this or would you be interested in that? Through Teaching Artist Rocks, often, I'll get a call or an email about a potential opportunity, and I'll see, does this fit into my schedule? Is this something that I feel I'd be competent enough to do? And I'd say my advice would be keep things flexible and also keep things honest with yourself. It's very easy to burn yourself out in this field. It's also very easy to give yourself projects that might not necessarily speak to what sings to you. And I would hope for more as we continue as a field for people to continue to be able to do work that reflects their interest and things that they're specifically passionate about.
What's a project you haven't been able to do yet that you hope to pursue?
A personal project I'd like to do. This has been on the back burner. I have a sticky note on my computer right now that's like 3 years old. Recently, my family was able to find, my mom was recently moving out of her house and she found a box of my grandmother's old cameras. And part of my childhood, you're doing, life and you're doing like birthdays, Christmas, and what you'll hear is like the click of a Kodak camera. So finding those cameras is really exciting. My long-term project that these will help with, my goal is to do a series of portraits that are of my family, my family tree, going back as far as I can, and as well working with that reference to the best of its ability. If I get a photo from the 1900s and it's the early 1900s and it's a little blurry, painting it as I see that. Potentially maybe looking at other references, or if someone has, like, again, if I'm painting my great-grandmother, looking at reference of my grandmother and seeing if I can find ways to interpret that information. That's on my, that is something I'm looking forward to maybe pursuing more recently with the finding of the recent cameras. But that's my personal project for the last few years.
Can you think of a moment with a student where something just clicked, or a story where you feel that you reached somebody in a way that you hadn't before, or maybe that they hadn't been reached before?
Yeah, I would say when I'm working, I can give a more recent example. Last week, we're currently on spring break, but last week I was working with a student and I was walking them through their painting process. And one thing that kept coming up for this student was that they felt that they were losing control of their paint too soon, that it was getting very goopy on their surfaces. And I talked them through this process of building up your layers and talking about, like, the metaphor I use often is, if you're painting, you want to start thin, which I would speak to like the floor, and then the thickest you could go is the ceiling. What I'd say is you want to start from the lowest level you can and choose to work your way up to the ceiling, as opposed to starting there or starting halfway up the wall. And when I talked to my student about this, and it really clicked for them that it's a matter of gradualism, that really clicked for them. Often, a lot of students I work with, sometimes they just they look at the end, they look at the finished paintings, and that's all they've seen their whole life is finished paintings. And they'll think, okay, every stroke I make, every time I touch the board, it has to reflect a finished mark. And there's some artists who work like that, but more often than not, in teaching especially, you're showing someone a gradual process of a technique. So for them, the moment they realize that it's like you're working through preliminary stages, and that, most paintings have like layers below them that you don't see. When they realized it was a process and it wasn't an act of individual like perfect strokes here or there, when they realized that it was time intensive and not like talent. You didn't need like this raw talent to do it. That really moved them a lot, and that's something I really hope to do with my students. I think one of the things I really come back to is that, especially in our field when we teach, there's this really big argument of talent, about this innate skill. And I find that to be, I think it gets in the way. I think when we talk so much about talent, it outweighs the fact that every artist we know that we like, that's a household name, maybe they had some innate skill, but they are known for what the skill they taught themselves, the skill that they were trained in. And I think that's very encouraging for people. One element of my research that I do is I research propaganda and the history of imagery and how that's affected how certain groups are seen and how certain groups are depicted historically. I reflect often on a strong example would be the Uncle Sam poster, the I Want You poster. Rosie the Riveter is a great American example of how these works of art radically shifted the paradigm of our society, whether it be gender roles or people being willing to go to war, even challenging wars. One example that I think is very important, though, is not only just that we can do things that inspire people, but we can also do work that there's work that exists that can be problematic and also just malicious in its nature. And we have a responsibility to understand how propaganda works in our society relative to public well-being. There's an example of this film, Birth of a Nation from 1915. For those who are unaware, it's a white supremacist film. It was the first film shown in the White House. And the sitting president, Woodrow Wilson, he referred to it as history written with lightning, which is an incredible way to describe a terrible thing. In that film, it's spreading and its popularity directly correlated to higher membership in white supremacist organizations and a higher rate of hate crimes and lynchings in the United States. The reason I bring this one up is because it's really vital, I think, as a society that we recognize that the arts are not necessarily just a hobby, that they're not just necessarily an act of individual expression, but that they also have a deep potential to shift our worldviews, to shift and give both permission and also discourage certain things. And we should be very aware of that as we create work. Not necessarily every time you paint an apple, you think about the ramifications of painting an apple, but being aware that when you're telling stories, when you're making art, and all art is storytelling, to think about who is in that story, why they're there, who isn't there, and why those people aren't there, and develop work that you think is spreading a message that you think is constructive, or maybe it's not. Maybe you're not trying to save the world necessarily, but at the very least, making work that you consider how people might interpret that. I think in the modern day, especially, I know. I haven't checked this recently, but I was reading in college that on average, we see tens of thousands of images a day. And we don't often consider the ramifications of seeing that much imagery and how much that can affect our worldviews, our paradigms, what we are okay with, what we aren't okay with, and where we're okay with certain things happening. And I think it's a part of the teaching artist responsibility to encourage people to have a joy of art, but also to have a critical analysis of it and observe what the impact of certain work can be, and hopefully encourage people to create art that they believe will benefit the world around them. Not necessarily all the time. I think people should be allowed to explore and do work that is sometimes just silly and goofy and stuff like that, but also to make work that I think would be that they think would help serve a well-being toward the world they're in.
I think that brings us right back to where we started with the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility.
I'm always going to bring a conversation back to Spider-Man if I can. So it's fine.
And you did that well. And yes, I think that says it really well, that we all have to use our art power as well as be careful with how we use our art power and think about it. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this adventure. I really appreciate your time and
thank you for having
the
me.
Thoughts you've shared. To learn more about Unique Fair Smith and his work, you can see it at uniquefairart.com, as well as following the links in the show notes and at brushwithknowledge.com. To learn more about everyone on our program, follow the links in the show notes and at brushwithknowledge.com. This podcast has been launched with funding from Genesee Valley Council on the Arts and the New York State Council on the Arts. Recording has been done at Rockvox Recording and Production. To learn how you can help support the creation of future episodes, please follow links in the show notes or visit brushwithknowledge.com.